He sat in velvet robes, but he didn't know who he was. He looked around the hall, wide-eyed, and whispered, "What is my name?" No one answered. This was not a prisoner, not a peasant, not a child. This was the King of France. A man once called Charles the Beloved, the Beautiful, the hope of the crown. But now, he flinched at touch, screamed at his own reflection, believed his bones were made of glass, and begged his servants not to let him shatter. He didn't speak of laws, or wars, or God. Only silence, and monsters, and broken things that weren't there. Sometimes he couldn't remember his wife. Sometimes he didn't recognize his children. Sometimes he didn't even know he had been crowned. For 30 years, France had a king, but no ruler. A crown without a voice, a throne without a mind, a body without a name. And behind palace doors, as France burned and bled, the king stared at the walls. Counting cracks, he was not mad when he was born. He was not forgotten when he began. But history does not wait for the broken, and so it erased him, not with swords, not with poison, but with time, with shame, with silence. This is the story of a man born to rule a kingdom, but lost inside his own mind. A man they once called the Beloved, until they locked the doors and left him alone. But Charles was not always broken. There was a time when France loved him, when bells rang for his name, when he smiled like a boy who believed in peace. So what happened? What broke the beloved king? And how did the golden child of France become the ghost in the palace? To understand the end, we must go back to the beginning, before the silence, before the shadows crept in. There was music. Soft violins echoing down sunlit corridors, books bound in red leather, paintings too large for the walls that held them, and a crib, gold-trimmed, velvet-lined, where a child slept beneath a banner of lilies. He was born in December in the cold heart of Paris, to a queen they called the Wise, and a king who dreamed of legacy. Charles, the sixth of his name, the one they would later call the Beloved. From the moment he opened his eyes, France placed its hopes in them. A boy to unite the kingdom, to heal the wounds of war, to prove that kings could still be just and gentle and golden. They said his eyes sparkled like polished glass, that his laugh made even the coldest courtiers smile, that his footsteps were so light, you'd think he walked on clouds. He was not raised by hands, but by expectations. At age 4, he was called Your Grace. At age 7, he was paraded through Paris on horseback. At age 11, he was crowned. Imagine that. A crown heavier than his shoulders, a throne taller than his frame, a silence deeper than he knew how to fill. But still, he smiled, because he believed. He believed that kings could be kind, that peace was possible, that God had chosen him for something more. In his early reign, they called him Le Bien-Aimé, the Beloved, and he was. He lowered taxes, built hospitals, tried to reconcile feuding nobles not with blood, but with bread. He rode into villages without armor, greeted children by name, sat with farmers, asking what the harvest was like. To Francois, he was the boy king of miracles. And in a world of iron and plague and fire, he felt like hope. but beneath the velvet, the cracks were waiting. His grandfather had gone mad before him. So had his cousin, the Queen of Naples. There were rumors, unspoken but whispered in stone halls, of something cursed in the royal blood. They dismissed it, because Charles was good, and bright, and strong. Until the day the light flickered. At age 24, he left for Brittany on horseback, a summer campaign, routine. But somewhere in the forest, under the August sun, the boy who smiled at peasants picked up a sword and drove it through his own knight's skull. No warning, no rage, only a scream, and blood, and panic. He ran into the trees, shouting names that weren't his, fighting enemies that weren't there, until his horse bucked. And Charles collapsed, twitching in the dirt, eyes wide, mouth foaming. He was carried back, wrapped in silence. And when he woke, he asked, "Where am I? Who are you? Why is there fire in the walls?" They told him it was exhaustion. Too much sun, not enough rest. But it wasn't the sun. It was something deeper, older, quieter. Something that had waited patiently in his blood. After that day, he changed. Not all at once. Not in ways that could be measured by doctors or priests. But in glimpses. He forgot names. He wept without cause. He slept for days, or not at all. He laughed at things no one said. Once he asked to be undressed, because his clothes were too loud. Once he refused to move for hours, because he feared he'd shatter. They still called him the Beloved, but now it was whispered, not praised. France was afraid. But hope dies last, and so they hoped it would pass. He still signed edicts, still showed up at feasts, still rode through cities waving with pale hands. But if you looked closely, his eyes weren't focused. His hands trembled, and he never spoke without being spoken to. Still, the people cheered, because they needed him to be okay. But he wasn't. And as the years crept forward, France would learn. When a king forgets himself, others will not wait. They will circle, smile, and begin to take pieces, one duchy at a time, one minister, one seal. Soon Charles wouldn't even know what had been taken. He would sign decrees he didn't read, marriages he didn't remember, war declarations he didn't understand. And all the while, they still dressed him in gold, still sat him on the throne, still called him king. But in truth, Charles had already left. The palace simply hadn't noticed yet. But madness doesn't scream all at once. It whispers first, softly, like wind under the door. And in Charles's case, the wind was getting louder. Next came the glass, and with it, the fear of breaking, the fear of touch, the fear of being seen. Because soon the king would forget not just his name, but the shape of being human. It began with a sound, not a scream, not a clash of swords, just a crack. A servant dropped a cup in the corridor, porcelain, fine, imported. It hit the stone and shattered like rain, and Charles flinched, not just from the noise, but from what he felt inside. He pressed his palms to his chest, then to his arms, then to his cheeks, and whispered, "Was that me?" From that day forward, he became afraid of things that weren't there, and more afraid of the things that were. Mirrors, footsteps, his own breath in the cold. He asked for his bed sheets to be light, no wool, no weight. He walked with slow, wide steps. He refused to let anyone touch his shoulders. When courtiers tried to embrace him, he wept because he believed, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically, that his body was made of glass. He feared that a single tap, a single fall, a single hug might break him. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. They called it glass delusion. Today, we might name it a psychosis. Then it was seen as a curse, a punishment, a royal shame. No one knew what to do. Some priests tried to pray it out. Some doctors tried bloodletting. Others whispered about witches, but nothing helped. And so, they hid him. Curtains were drawn tighter, rooms padded. Attendants instructed not to speak unless spoken to. If you walked into his chamber, you had to walk quietly, bow low, and never, ever look him in the eyes too long. Because sometimes he'd scream, "Don't look! You'll see me shatter!" There were days he forgot who he was. There were days he remembered, and that was worse. Because on those days he asked why God had abandoned him, why he couldn't hold his own son, why the bells had stopped ringing. He'd wake at night and scream into the walls, rip at his robes, smear food across the floor. He called his wife the woman with fire, called his children the shadows. But still, they dressed him in gold, still called him His Majesty, still paraded him briefly on balconies, so the public would not ask too many questions. They told France he was ill, that he needed rest, that he was recovering, but he wasn't. And behind closed doors, he became a thing. Not a man, not a king, just a body. They stopped giving him reports, stopped asking for his approval. They brought him quills, already inked, papers, already written. He signed, and didn't ask why. Sometimes they didn't even give him paper, just blank parchment, so he could feel useful. The council ruled without him. Ministers made deals in his name, and France drifted further and further from its king. Meanwhile, Charles counted the cracks in his ceiling, named them, whispered to them. He asked for silence at meals, because the sound of knives scraping plates sounded like broken ribs. He asked for no mirrors, no shoes with heels, no bells, and no touch, especially not that. He wore thick gloves, piled his clothes in folds. Even on summer days, he covered his body like a winter ghost. Because glass, he said, shatters fastest when it's warm. And France began to forget his voice. Children born after 1400 had never heard the king speak. Ministers rarely saw him walk. But they still called him Charles VI, still minted coins with his face, still wrote plays to honor his wisdom. It was easier that way, to pretend, to mythologize, because the truth was more terrifying. The truth was, their king was still alive, still breathing, still crowned, but no longer there. He lived in a palace of silence, sat on a throne of lies, watched by men who ruled without him, but still bowed when convenient. And through it all, Charles whispered, to cracks, to shadows, to the part of himself that still remembered being a boy riding through Paris, as cheers rang through the air. But memory is not mercy, and Charles's mind, what remained of it, would soon become a battlefield. Because when a king cannot hold the sword, others will fight to take it. And what came next was not just madness, but manipulation, blood, and betrayal. The king had broken. Now the kingdom would too. A kingdom cannot wait forever, not even for its king. So while Charles counted cracks, France began to split. The council was divided. The nobles, restless. The treasury, leaking coin like blood from a wound. And in the vacuum left by the king's silence, others began to speak, louder and sharper. Two names would come to define the storm: Louis of Orleans and John of Burgundy, the king's brother and the king's cousin. One wore velvet and perfume, the other wore iron and scorn. One whispered poetry, the other sharpened knives. They both claimed to serve Charles, both claimed to love France, but each, in truth, desired something else. The throne, not directly, not yet, but through control, through shadows, through the hollow shell of a man once called the Beloved. Louis was charming, cunning. He had the queen's ear, and through her, he gained access to the royal seal. Soon, documents bore Charles's name, but not his will. Laws changed, taxes shifted, enemies vanished from court. And when Charles had moments of lucidity, he would read royal edicts he didn't remember writing and weep. John of Burgundy watched this unfold and fumed. To him, Louis was a serpent, feeding on the king's weakness. So John struck back, not with whispers, but with soldiers. He brought steel into council chambers, accused Louis of sorcery, of treason, of poisoning the king's mind. Charles, sitting nearby, shivered under a fur cloak, his eyes blank, his hands trembling. He did not understand the accusations, nor the war that was coming, because this was no longer a court. It was a chessboard. And Charles, he was the king piece, but not the player. And so, the first blow fell. In 1407, under moonlight in Paris, Louis of Orleans was ambushed by masked men. His skull split open, his body dumped in the street. They said he screamed once, then fell silent. John of Burgundy claimed responsibility, proudly. He called it a tyrant's execution. But France cracked. Riots flared, towns chose sides. The court fractured into two rival houses, Armagnacs, loyal to Orleans, Burgundians, loyal to John. Civil war, born from madness, fanned by ambition. And the king remained in his chambers, wrapped in furs, telling the walls he was sorry. They tried to bring him to council, tried to parade him again, to restore calm. But by now, Charles feared sunlight, feared movement, feared his own reflection. So they gave up and let France burn around him. And still, they used his name. Every battle, every law, every execution, all done in the name of a man who could no longer write his own. But power has gravity, and England felt the pull. Henry V crossed the Channel with fire in his eyes, saw France divided, vulnerable. He saw a throne defended by ghosts, a kingdom ruled by silence. And so, he struck. At Agincourt, with longbows and mud, he shattered the French army, left thousands dead, nobles, knights, heirs. France reeled, and the court panicked. Charles was too far gone, the Dauphin too young, the nobles too divided. So a treaty was drafted, the Treaty of Troyes, one that would change everything. It named Henry V as heir to the French crown. through marriage to Charles's daughter. It disinherited the Dauphin. It handed over France, piece by piece, to the enemy. And Charles? Charles signed it. Not out of agreement, but confusion. He didn't understand the paper in front of him. Didn't recognize the names. Didn't even know it was his daughter being offered like livestock. He just dipped the pen and signed because they told him to. And when it was done, he whispered, "Did I do well today?" The courtiers said yes and left the room. Behind them, the king looked out the window. The garden was empty. The wind shook the glass, and for a moment, he feared again that he might shatter. But France wasn't done with him, because when a man is weak, they pity him. When a king is weak, they use him. And soon, Charles would become more than a ghost. He would become a weapon. A figurehead in a game so twisted, even blood would forget whose side it's on. The beloved was already broken, but now he would be feared. For a time, they had pitied him. The court whispered about his illness with sighs, with glances, with the sort of tone you use when speaking of things already gone. They dressed him, fed him, kept him hidden, like a precious relic too delicate to use. But war does not wait for pity, nor does power. And as France bled, the narrative began to change. The king was no longer a wounded dove. He was a crack in the hull, a danger to the ship, because even a mad king can still wear a crown. And Charles still had one, still signed papers, still held audiences when lucid, still spoke on days when the fog lifted just enough for words to form. And that terrified them, because when Charles spoke, what he said didn't always align with the war, didn't align with the ministers, with the treaty, with the plans already drawn. One day, he called for the Dauphin, said he wanted his son back in court, said the treaty was a mistake. The court froze, because to undo the Treaty of Troyes was to undo every alliance they had made, every fragile bond they had stitched together with fear, marriage, and blood. So they changed the subject, redirected him, promised they'd consider it. But he insisted. He spoke in fragments. But the message was clear. France is not England's to inherit. My blood is still here. I am not dead. That was the moment they stopped pitying him and started fearing him, because mad or not, Charles still was king, and kings, no matter how broken, can still break things. So they tightened his circle, cut his access, reduced his attendance to only the most loyal. They said it was for his health, but it was for their control. The tapestries were changed, paintings removed, letters intercepted. Even the food was filtered twice, not for poison, but for information. Because Charles had started speaking again, to servants, to ghosts, to the walls, and the walls had ears. They say one night he wandered barefoot through the palace, muttering in Latin, dragging a broken goblet. He stopped at a guard post and whispered, "The lilies are bleeding. France is choking on her own crown." The next day, that guard was transferred. The hallway repainted. The event erased. But Charles remembered. And when the fog cleared, he asked, "Where is the man with kind eyes?" No one answered, because they feared what else he remembered and what he might say next. There were rumors that he had cursed the Dauphin, that he had summoned spirits, that he had ordered a priest to dig up old bones beneath the chapel. None were true, but none were refuted either. Because fear is useful. And soon, fear became policy. The queen was told to limit her visits. Ministers entered his chambers only in pairs. Letters from the Dauphin were burned unopened. Charles became a living paradox, too mad to rule, too royal to remove. And so, they watched him, day and night, like a lion in a cage, not because he might escape, but because he might speak. And sometimes, he did. In 1418, as the Burgundians marched toward Paris, Charles rose from his bed. He called for armor, demanded a sword, shouted names long dead. No one gave him steel, only robes and tea. But that night he escaped his chambers, climbed a servant's stairwell barefoot, found a scribe in the courtyard, and dictated a letter. To the Dauphin. They say it was barely legible. Words smeared by shaking hands, ink mixed with tears. But it was real. And when the letter reached the Dauphin, he wept, because for a moment, his father had returned. But that moment was dangerous, because if the Dauphin used it, claimed it, rallied behind it, then everything the treaty promised would be undone. So the letter was declared a forgery, the scribe arrested, Charles sedated, and once again, the silence returned. But the court had learned something that night. The king still had a voice, however rare, however fragile. And if that voice ever aligned with the wrong side, the consequences would be catastrophic. So they changed their strategy, from watching to isolating. Charles's rooms were moved deeper into the palace. Windows narrowed, doors locked from the outside. He no longer saw the gardens, no longer heard the bells, only flickers of light and the sound of his own breath. And yet, he still whispered, to himself, to cracks, to God. They began calling him the Hollow King, and some feared he would live forever, a relic of a broken age, a body crowned in name only. But time is not so merciful. Soon they would stop watching him altogether, not because he was safe, but because he was finished. And what came next was not punishment by decree or exile or shame. It was something worse, something colder, something even madness could not soften. Forgetting. The beloved would not be killed. He would be erased. You can punish a king without chains, without dungeons, without poison. All you have to do is forget him, not in memory, but in ritual. Stop ringing the bells, stop updating the portrait, stop saying his name in court, and eventually, even a crown begins to fade. That was how they punished Charles, not with swords, but with silence. They moved him to a far wing of the palace. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a bed, a basin, a priest who rarely spoke. The windows were narrowed, the doors muffled. He could hear the wind, but not the voices anymore. Once he had heard whispers through the walls, snippets of ministers, laughter, footsteps. Now, nothing. Even his guards no longer looked him in the eye. Some turned their backs. Others stared past him. To serve the king was no longer a privilege. It was a warning, because Charles had become a relic, an embarrassment, a reminder of a crown with no head. When new guests arrived to court, they were told, "Speak of the king only in past tense." He wasn't dead, but he wasn't allowed to live. Not publicly, not symbolically, not even spiritually. They removed his initials from the chapel embroidery, recast the coins, repainted the murals. One fresco had shown him in golden armor. That wall was white now, painted over in one afternoon. No ceremony, no prayer, just erasure. And in that room, in that narrowing silence, Charles remained, still breathing, still crowned, still waiting. He no longer screamed, or resisted, or asked questions. He simply sat, often in the same chair for hours, blinking slowly, tracing circles into the wood of the table with one finger. Sometimes he spoke to the furniture. Sometimes he sang lullabies to himself, songs his mother used to hum. Or maybe he imagined that part. He once asked a servant, "Am I a king, or was that someone else?" The servant didn't answer, because he didn't know, because maybe it was someone else now. The mind of France was gone, but the body, the throne, remained. And no one dared bury it, because you can't bury something still breathing. So they locked it away. Seasons passed. Wars flared, heirs came and went, and Charles remained. He was fed, bathed, clothed in clean robes. But he was not visited, not addressed, not even prayed for at Mass. A priest once slipped, mentioned the king by name in a blessing. He was reassigned by dusk, because the crown could not risk revival. Not now, not after all the lines had been redrawn. To acknowledge Charles was to acknowledge the lie, that France had a king but no ruler. So they kept lying, even as he wept, even as he begged to see the sky. One day a child wandered into his room, the son of a steward, lost. Charles looked up, startled, then smiled. He asked the boy his name, then gave him a wooden ring he had carved himself from the leg of a broken stool. The boy said thank you, ran off. By evening, his father had been dismissed. The boy never returned, because even a child's eyes can become a threat when they see the truth. That the king wasn't dead. He was waiting to be remembered, or forgiven, or released. But release never came. Not in spring, not in the autumn when the leaves turned and fell like robes. Not in the winter when the windows frosted and he asked for extra blankets, not because of the cold, but because the walls were whispering again. They say his final winter was quiet. No visitors, no illness, just a steady decline. He ate less, spoke less, breathed slower. One morning they found him curled on the floor beside the bed, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, hands folded over his chest. There was no blood, no note, no storm, just stillness. The man once called Charles the Beloved had died in a room that hadn't heard his name in years. The priest performed the rites, quickly, quietly. No bells rang, no public mourning, no declarations. They said, "The king is gone." But truthfully, he had been gone for years. All that remained was the shell they no longer had to feed. And when they buried him, there were no crowds, only a handful of attendants. No music, no flowers, no crown. Just a wooden box, lowered into a hole. The dirt covered him like memory covers shame. And France moved on. But dirt cannot silence history, and forgetting is never perfect, because someone always remembers. A servant, a song, a broken chair in a sealed room. And even if they buried Charles, they could not unwrite what they had done to him. Next, we return not to the king, but to those who erased him, and ask, what does power fear more than madness? The memory of it. There were no bells, no mourning cloths on the palace gates, no tolling chimes across Paris rooftops, not even a candle left in his window. When Charles VI died, France did not pause. Not for silence, not for memory, not even for breath. The moment his last sigh disappeared into the rafters, so did his legacy. No painter was summoned. No chronicle recorded his final words. No priest composed a hymn. Just a name scratched into a burial log next to a date, and the word interred. Not even king. His funeral was small, deliberately so, held in the early morning mist while the city still slept. A wooden box, unmarked, not lacquered, not lined with velvet. They say it creaked when they lowered it, as if the coffin, too, refused to carry the weight of his memory. No procession followed. No choir sang. Just the crunch of boots and the scrape of shovel against stone. The man once called the beloved was buried like a stranger, because by then, that's what he was, even to his own country. There had been no farewell, no final audience, no vigil of candlelight and whispered prayers, because that would require something dangerous. Acknowledgement. To mourn Charles properly was to admit what had been done. That France had left its king in a room without light until he forgot how to speak. And kings are not supposed to die that way. So instead, they let the silence continue, let it swell, until the silence itself became his eulogy. There were whispers, of course, among the old servants, the forgotten pages, the midwives and gardeners and mute boys who had once glimpsed him in passing. He was kind, one of them said. He used to hum when he combed his hair. He gave me a wooden ring, said another. But their voices were not written, only remembered. And memories, like kings, are easy to bury, especially when no one wants to dig them back up. Across France, life resumed. New banners were hung, new portraits unveiled, new coins pressed, this time with different faces. And Charles faded like breath on glass. Even the church did not speak his name. His soul, they said, was in the hands of God. But they did not pray for it. They did not light candles in his name on the day of his death, because lighting a candle would mean admitting there was darkness, and history prefers light, even if it's false. So they wrote the story differently, not in books, but in absence. They did not lie, they simply left things out, like the cries, the poems scratched into bedposts, the broken mirrors, the sound of a crown being set on the floor, softly, because even brass seemed too loud for him. They left out the years, the 3 decades of silence, of war made in his name, of treaties signed with his hand. They left out the man and kept only the title. Charles VI reigned from 1380 to 1422. Full stop. Next line. But truth leaves echoes, and echoes find their way into cracks. One day, a child wandered into an old room in a half-forgotten palace. The windows sealed, the walls warped with moisture. In the corner, a chair, a wooden ring, and a faint inscription scratched into the wall. I am still here. They say the boy ran, cried, told his tutor, and the next day the room was sealed. Again, because even in death, Charles was inconvenient. He had not died loudly, but he had not died cleanly either. He lingered, not as a ghost, but as a gap, a tear in the story they tried to sew shut. And every so often, that gap reopened. When someone mentioned his name, when a scholar asked about the missing years, when a painting was discovered beneath another painting, the silence was not perfect. It never is. But silence is not the end of power. It's how power hides the end. And now we ask, who decided Charles's voice was dangerous? Who erased the frescoes? Who painted over grief? Who rewrote the life of the beloved king until he became no one at all? In the next chapter, we enter the halls of history not to remember, but to expose what was deliberately forgotten. No one tore the pages. No one set fire to the records. No one stood up in the court of France and declared, "Forget the king." They didn't have to. Erasure doesn't begin with destruction. It begins with distance, with skipping a name in a genealogy, with placing a comma where there should be a chapter, with letting the ink fade without ever rewriting it. And so they erased Charles VI not by lie, but by omission. In the official records, he was reduced to dates. Reigned 1380 to 1422. Nothing else. No mention of the fractured mind, the shattered glass delusion, the stolen decades. No mention of Agincourt, the treaty signed by a man who didn't know what year it was. No mention of the 30 years France ruled without a voice. They left it out because truth was inconvenient. Because to tell the full story would mean confronting what they had done. That they had used a broken man's name to justify war, to sign deaths, to betray their own blood. And kings may go mad, but history always prefers to look sane. So the scribes focused on others. Henry the Dauphin, the dukes, the mistresses, the victories and defeats, anyone but the man at the center of it all. Even in stained glass, Charles appeared less and less. First, with fading features, then not at all. His portrait in Notre Dame was taken down, his personal seal replaced, his likeness removed from coins, books, tapestries. The Louvre, then a royal residence, sealed the room he had once slept in. The door was painted shut, no plaque, no marker. They didn't want to remember, because memory, when it's truthful, is dangerous. It asks questions. It demands accountability. It opens wounds. So instead, they healed history with fiction. They said he was melancholy, a bit soft in the head, not unwell, just gentle. They said he died peacefully, in prayer, in faith. They said France moved forward because Charles had made peace with God and with kingship. But none of it was true. He had not made peace. He had wept in silence, begged in darkness. And when he died, there were no prayers, only relief. Because with him gone, the narrative was easier to write. Clean, linear, triumphant. A mad king didn't fit, especially one who had signed away a kingdom, watched his people die in his name, held power and couldn't hold a spoon. So they rewrote the story and left the blood on someone else's hands. It worked. For a time, the next generation didn't ask. The war with England consumed attention. The Dauphin, now Charles VII, rebuilt his image. France survived. But survival is not absolution, and whispers never die. They linger in archives, in paintings stored backwards, in poems never published, in stories told by old nurses to grandchildren who asked why there was a locked door with no key and no reason. And one day, a scholar opened a box. Inside, a letter, written in childlike script, signed shakily. Charles, by the grace of God, King of France. It contained no state secrets, only a request. Please let me see the sky again. Please let me feel my son's hand. It had never been sent. The court had kept it, filed it, and never spoken of it again. That letter changed the scholar's life. She wrote a paper, then a book, then stood in front of a hall full of students and said, "History owes this man an apology." And for a moment, the silence cracked. Because one mind, however broken, still echoes. One man, however erased, still exists if someone remembers him. And memory, once reignited, spreads. A poet wrote a verse. The glass king slept while fire took his throne. A painter reimagined his last days, not in madness, but in color. A playwright staged his voice, giving him lines he never got to speak. And just like that, the beloved returned. Not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a man, flawed, forgotten, feared, and finally, seen. But not all memory is mercy. Some who revive the dead do so not to honor, but to possess. And as Charles's name rose again in ink and brush, it began to change. Twisted, idealized, marketed. What happens when history remembers too late and too wrongly? And who gets to decide what the dead should mean when they can no longer answer for themselves? He never got a monument. No statue in the palace garden, no grand cathedral stained with his face, no bridge or boulevard named after him. But history has more than stone, and silence eventually calls for a voice. It began not with kings, but with poets. In the 1600s, a single line in a forgotten sonnet. He wept for a country that never heard him. Then, a painting, centuries later. Charles in a dim chamber, wrapped in light and shadow, his eyes turned not outward, but upward. Then came a play, then a novel, then a film. Not all were kind. Some turned him into a tragic fool, others into a divine mystic, a few into something close to a prophet. And none of them truly knew him, because you cannot know someone who was silenced before they could speak for themselves. But still, he returned, piece by piece, not as a ruler, not even as a man, but as a mirror. Each age reflected its own fears through him. In times of war, he was the king too weak to hold a sword. In times of peace, he was the victim of power without compassion. During revolutions, he was a symbol of what happens when people obey too long. And in modern times, he became a case study. Madness, delusion, genetic inbreeding, trauma, depression. Doctors wrote journals. Psychologists debated diagnoses. Glass delusion, catatonia, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Some even argued Charles had moments of clarity, that he was aware of the very system that caged him, and chose madness as a final form of protest. Others said, no, he was just a broken man. But whether clinical or poetic, scientific or spiritual, Charles now had what he never had while alive: a voice. And with that voice came meaning. But meaning is never neutral. Some used him to warn, others to inspire. There were books titled The Glass King, operas called The Silence of Charles, even modern art installations made of translucent crystal rooms, inviting viewers to step inside and feel the fear of shattering. Suddenly, he was everywhere. And yet, not himself. Because each portrayal bent his story into the shape the teller needed. One century made him saintly, another made him grotesque. One painted him bathed in divine light. Another surrounded him with beasts. But none of them sat with the man. None of them stayed long enough to ask, "Who were you, really?" Because Charles wasn't a metaphor. He was a child, a brother, a father, a man who loved birds, who once carved a ring for a steward's son, who liked music in the mornings but feared thunderstorms at night. He wasn't just glass. He wasn't just a king. He was a person, with a mind that cracked in a world that punished cracks. And even as his image spread, his truth, the warm breathing, frightened truth, remained hazy. Because history may remember events, but it rarely remembers pain the way pain was lived. Yet something shifted. One day, a historian found a scrap of paper, tucked into a book of royal inventory. On it, a note in fading script: "Do not remove the chair. He still sits there in his dreams." It wasn't signed. It wasn't dated. But someone had remembered. Someone had known that the man who once ruled France still haunted a single object in a single room that had once been filled with light. And from that detail, a new generation began to ask deeper questions. Not just, what was wrong with him? But, what was wrong with us? What kind of kingdom turns away from a suffering king? What kind of power uses a broken mind as a mask for its own crimes? What kind of court leaves its monarch to rot and then repaints the hall so no one asks why it smells like regret? These questions became louder, harder to ignore, and Charles, at last, began to take shape. Not as a cautionary tale, not as a clinical specimen, but as a symbol of the cost of abandonment, the weight of expectation, the cruelty of systems that prize strength but discard the unwell. And so, museums began to hang his portrait again. Schools taught his story. Writers put his name on their dedications. For those who were erased, but never gone. He was no longer invisible, but not because they crowned him again. They didn't need to, because now we see the cracks. We know what they mean, and we do not turn away. But history cannot love, it can only remember. So what do we owe the dead when memory is all they have left? In the final chapter, we ask, what did Charles teach us? About kingship, about silence, about being human. And if he could speak to us now, what might he whisper from the room no one dared enter? If you walk through the Louvre today, past the paintings of conquest and coronation, through the halls echoing with triumph, you might miss it. A small door, unmarked, closed. Behind it, an empty room. The air smells of wood polish and dust. The windows face away from the sun. There's a single chair in the corner, and for reasons no one explains, it's never moved. Some say the chair belonged to Charles VI. Others say it's a myth, just a story. But stories matter, because history forgets what's inconvenient. But stories, they hold on. And Charles VI? He was a story long before he was a king, a child born with light in his hair, a boy who waved at crowds and believed in mercy, a ruler who wanted to heal, not conquer. And then, a silence that lasted longer than his words. And yet, we remember him, not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. Because his life was not a legend, it was a warning. That power without compassion rots from the inside. That crowns weigh more when no one helps carry them. That even kings, especially kings, can break. And when they do, we must not look away. Charles taught us what happens when we treat pain as shame, when we silence the wounded instead of listening. He showed us the cost of turning illness into a secret, into a weakness, into a reason to erase. He reminded us that madness is not monstrous, but human and lonely and deserving of care. His enemies feared his instability, but what they feared more was his reflection of their own cruelty. Because Charles, in the end, wasn't dangerous because he was broken. He was dangerous because he still loved, still asked for his son, still believed that someone would open the door. He died waiting. But maybe he died hoping too. And maybe, just maybe, he was right to hope, because now we do open that door. We say his name. We paint his face not with gold and laurel, but with shadow and truth. We let the silence echo, and then we answer it, not with glory, but with gentleness. And that is enough. Not to rewrite what was done, but to say, finally, he was here. Charles VI didn't lose his kingdom with a war. He lost it in silence. And that's what stays with me. Not the politics, not the treaties, but the image of a man, still breathing, still crowned, locked away because no one knew what to do with his suffering. We often think power protects people, but sometimes it isolates them. Sometimes it erases them. Charles wasn't feared because he was cruel. He was feared because he reminded everyone that even kings can fall apart. That mental illness doesn't care about bloodlines, and that fragility is not weakness. It's human. We didn't fail Charles because he went mad. We failed him because when he needed love, we gave him walls. And if history teaches us anything, it's that every system, no matter how big, can forget the people at its center, especially when those people are quietly breaking. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If someone like Charles, surrounded by gold, power, and titles, can be forgotten while still alive, what about the people around you who are silently fading? Are you listening? Or are you already looking away?